Evicted at 72 with nothing but a canvas duffel, a dead wife's wedding ring, and his father's old hand plane, Elias Hollis stood at the edge of the only road out of Pilot Hollow and realized he had nowhere on this earth to go. He had been widowed for 40 years. 40 years of pouring 2 cups of coffee every morning and setting the second one on a windowsill for a woman who died in an ice storm in 1985. But the small house where he had kept her memory alive was no longer his. The developer's truck had already passed him going the other way. The deputy had been kind. The crabapple tree in the backyard, where Corinne and their baby daughter Wren were buried under 2 small stones, would belong to a stranger by sundown. He walked without a destination, an old luthier with careful hands and a broken heart. Say, following a creek he half remembered from a fishing trip with his father 65 years ago, because the sound of moving water was the only thing in the world that still felt like company. He slept one night under a highway overpass. He ate the last of his crackers on the second morning. And on the third day, deep in the woods where no road went and no smoke rose, he came around a bend in the creek and looked up through the bare trees, and saw a roofline he should not have recognized but somehow did. An old cabin, forgotten, waiting, as if it had been standing there the entire 40 years he had been grieving, holding its breath for him to arrive. But who had built that cabin in the middle of nowhere, and why did the iron latch lift for Elias on the first try as though it already knew his hand? What was hidden in the drawer beneath the old workbench that had been waiting 70 years for the right pair of hands to find it? And how could a man who had lost his wife, his daughter, his home, and every reason he once had to keep going, a man the world had quietly evicted from his own life, slowly, carefully, one winter at a time, build something inside those 4 walls that 40 years of grief had never let him build anywhere else? The morning it all fell apart. Elias was standing in his kitchen on Dogwood Lane, pouring coffee into 2 white mugs the way he had every single morning since February 1985. One for himself, one for the windowsill. He set the second mug in the small patch of sun above the sink, beside a little glass jar that held a dried sprig of mountain laurel, and he said softly, the way he always did, "Morning, Corinne." The house was quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, the crabapple tree in the back corner of the yard was bare and black against a gray November sky, and beneath it, half hidden in the dead grass, were 2 small stones. One said, "Corinne Hollis, beloved." One said, "Wren, our little bird." He had carved them both with his own hands 40 years ago. He had not missed a morning at that windowsill in 14,600 days. Then the knock came at the door. He knew before he opened it. He had known since the letter arrived 3 weeks ago in a plain white envelope he had almost thrown away. He wiped his hands on a dish towel and walked slowly through the little house, past the wall of photographs, past the rocking chair he had built for Corinne the year they were married, and past the workshop door behind which 40 years of violins and dulcimers still hung silent on their pegs. And he opened the door to a young deputy with kind eyes and a piece of paper in his hand. "Mr. Hollis," the deputy said. He could not finish the sentence. He did not have to. Elias nodded. "I know, son. Come in. I'll just be a minute." He did not argue. He did not beg. He had fallen off a ladder the spring before and spent 4 months with a broken hip that would not heal, and the orders for instruments had stopped, and the property taxes had piled up like snow against a door he could not open, and a developer from somewhere in Georgia had bought the tax lien at the courthouse auction without ever setting foot in Pilot Hollow. The deputy gave him 1 extra hour, 1 hour to say goodbye to a life. Elias packed slowly, the way a man packs when he is not really leaving. Into the canvas duffel went 2 flannel shirts, a pair of wool socks, a tin of aspirin, and a small wooden box. Inside the box, Corinne's thin gold wedding ring, a curl of dark baby hair wrapped in tissue paper gone yellow with age, and the photograph from their wedding day at the little church in Pilot Hollow in 1977. From the workshop, he took only one thing: his father's hand plane, the first woodworking tool he had ever held, when he was 7 years old and his father lifted him onto a stool and closed his small fingers around the handle and said, "Now you listen to the wood, boy. It'll tell you what it wants to be." Then he went out the back door. He walked across the dead grass to the crabapple tree, and then he knelt down between the two small stones with a sound coming out of his chest that was not quite a word and not quite a sob, and he pressed one hand flat against the cold ground above Corinne and the other hand flat against the cold ground above Wren. His shoulders shook. His breath made small white clouds in the November air. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I am so sorry. I promised I would never leave you here alone. I promised." A cold wind moved through the bare branches of the crabapple tree, and a single brown leaf drifted down and landed on the back of his hand, and for one strange second he could have sworn the wind sounded like a woman's voice saying his name. He closed his eyes. "I'll come back for you," he said. "I don't know how. I don't know when. But I will come back for you both. I swear it on my father's hands." He stood up slowly, his bad hip crying out, and he walked back through the house one last time, and he set his own coffee mug beside hers on the windowsill, untouched. He did not drink it. He could not. At the front door, Ruthie from next door was waiting, her eyes wet, her hands twisting a dish towel. "Elias, honey, please, I've got the spare room made up. Don't you do this. Don't you walk out of here like some stray dog with nowhere to go." He took her hand. Her hand was warm. "Ruthie," he said gently, "if I sit down in somebody else's kitchen tonight, then these 40 years with her really are over, and I am not ready for them to be over. Do you understand me?" She did not understand, but she nodded anyway, because she loved him. And Elias Hollis shouldered his canvas duffel and walked down the porch steps of the little house on Dogwood Lane for the last time. At the end of the driveway, he turned left instead of right, away from town, away from Ruthie, away from the cemetery where people said Corinne should have been buried, away from every road he had ever known. He walked past the welcome sign at the edge of Pilot Hollow. He walked past the old Baptist church. He walked until the pavement ended and the gravel began, and then he walked until the gravel ended and an old logging track began, and then he stopped at the mouth of that track because something he could not name was pulling at the inside of his chest like a fishing line. Sawyer's Fork. The words came up out of him like they had been waiting 65 years to be said out loud. Sawyer's Fork. So where his daddy had taken him fishing the summer he turned 9, with a cane pole and a tin of worms and a ham sandwich wrapped in wax paper. He had not thought about that creek in half a century, but his feet remembered. His feet turned onto the logging track as if something ahead of him was calling his name, and the sound of water, faint, far away, silver, threaded through the trees, and Elias Hollis, 72 years old and freshly evicted from the only life he had ever known, began to walk deeper into the woods. He did not know yet that something was waiting for him at the end of that creek. Something his own grandfather had built with his own hands in 1911 and left in perfect order before he died. Something the world had forgotten for 58 years. Something that had been, by blood and by deed, and by a folder of papers Elias had filed away unread in the worst week of his life, his the entire time. He only knew that the sound of the water felt, for the first time since the deputy had knocked on his door, like company. He walked for a day and a half along that creek, and the woods got older with every mile. The trees grew taller, the light grew thinner. The sound of any road anywhere in the world fell away behind him until there was only water on stone and wind in bare branches and the soft scrape of his own boots on the fallen leaves. He slept the first night under a railroad overpass, curled around his duffel like a man protecting the last thing he owned. He ate the last 2 crackers from his pocket for breakfast. By the middle of the second day, his bad hip was screaming and his hands were shaking from hunger and cold, and he sat down on a mossy log beside the creek and put his face in his hands and said out loud, to no one, "Corinne, honey, I don't think I can do this." The wind moved through the laurel. The creek kept talking. Yeah, and something, he would never be able to explain what, made him stand back up and keep walking. On the 3rd morning, the creek bent sharply around a granite shelf, and Elias came around that bend, and he looked up through the bare trees, and he stopped breathing. A roofline, dark, weathered timber, peaked and narrow, set back in a small clearing where the early sun was just beginning to touch the ground. A stone chimney, a sagging porch, a single window catching the light like a closed eye. It was small. It was old. It was not ruined. And the strangest thing of all, Elias knew it. Somewhere deep underneath 50 years of forgetting, some 7-year-old boy still living inside him remembered being carried up these exact steps on his grandfather's shoulders in the winter of 1959, laughing, reaching for icicles hanging from that exact roof. He walked toward the cabin the way a man walks toward a dream he is afraid will disappear. Up the flat stones of the path. Up the 2 warped porch steps. And there, nailed above the door on a square of gray wood gone almost black with time, carved in letters his grandfather had cut with his own knife, were 3 words he had not seen in 63 years. Hollis Sugar Shack. His knees almost went out from under him. He reached for the iron latch with a hand that did not feel like his own hand, and the latch lifted on the first try, smooth as butter, as if it had been oiled yesterday, as if it had been waiting. The door swung open. Inside, the air was cold and still and clean, and it smelled of old wood and cold stone and faintly, impossibly, the ghost of maple smoke. 1 room, a stone hearth, a narrow cot frame, a tin lantern on a nail, a low workbench under the single window, an almanac on a shelf. Dust on every surface, yes, but the dust of a place left in order, not the dust of ruin. A place someone had closed up for the season and never come back to. Elias stepped inside with his canvas duffel on his shoulder and his father's hand plane in his hand and tears running down both sides of his face without him even knowing they were there. He set the duffel down on the plank floor. He looked around at the 1 small room that felt more like home than the house he had just lost. And he said, very softly, "Well, Corinne, here we are. If you are watching this story right now and something in your chest has already started to hurt, please do me one small favor before we go any further, and hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell, because what happens to Elias Hollis inside that cabin over the next 4 months is going to stay with you for a very long time, and I do not want you to miss a single minute of it. Thank you. Now let's go back inside with him. The first days were nothing but survival. He cleaned the stovepipe with a bundle of pine boughs tied to a stick. He dragged deadfall out of the woods for firewood, his bad hip shrieking with every log. He set a rusted old trap he found on a peg near a rabbit run at the edge of the clearing. He boiled creek water in a tin pan. He ate a thin, tough rabbit on his second night and cried while he ate it because he was so grateful and so ashamed of being so grateful. On the 4th morning, then he opened the cabin door to gather firewood and stopped dead on the porch step. A dog was sitting in the clearing, looking up at him. She was old. She was thin enough that he could count her ribs through her coat. 1 eye was clouded over white with blindness. She did not bark. She did not beg. She just sat in the frost-stiff grass and looked at him with the patience of an animal who had already decided that this man was her man and this cabin was her cabin, and she was simply waiting for him to catch up. Elias knelt down slowly, 1 hand on the porch rail to brace his hip. "Well," he whispered, "where did you come from, old girl?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out the last strip of dried meat he had, and he held it out, and she came forward on stiff legs and took it from his fingers as gently as a lady taking a flower. And that night she slept on the plank floor beside the stove. He named her June because it was November and she had walked out of the frozen woods like a small piece of summer, and because a 72-year-old man alone in a one-room cabin needs every small act of defiance he can find. A week later, he cleared off the old workbench. He was not expecting anything. He just wanted room to work on a small cedar box for Corinne's ring. He lifted an old oilcloth off the bench, and underneath, tucked into the single drawer, wrapped carefully in another square of oilcloth yellowed with 70 years of waiting, he found 6 small curved ribs of cherry wood, steam-bent by a craftsman's hand, and beside them a folded square of paper in his grandfather's handwriting that made the whole cabin tilt sideways. For the boy, when he comes. J. Hollis, a March 1952. Elias Hollis sat down hard on the cabin floor with the cherry ribs in his shaking hands and the note in his lap, and he understood, in one terrible and beautiful moment, what he was holding. His grandfather had started building a cradle for him. For him, Elias, the boy who was coming in the summer of 1952, and had died before he could finish it. The cradle had waited in that drawer for 70 years. 70 years. Through 2 generations. Through a world war ending and men walking on the moon and Corinne dying in an ice storm and 40 years of coffee poured into a windowsill, those 6 small cherry ribs had been lying in that drawer, waiting for the right pair of hands to come and finish what had been started. And now, by a road no man could have planned, those hands had arrived. But he pressed the cherry ribs against his chest and wept into the cold quiet of the cabin. And June came and laid her gray muzzle on his knee, and outside the first snowflakes of the season began to fall on the blue ridge. He did not know yet that the hardest night of his life was still waiting for him in January. He did not know yet that a young forest ranger with grief of her own in her eyes was already walking a ridgeline 2 miles away and would find his smoke before Christmas. He did not know yet that the same ice that had taken Corinne 40 years ago was coming back for him one more time. He only knew that his hands, for the first time in 4 decades, were holding something that needed him. Winter came down on the Blue Ridge like a hand closing into a fist. The snow piled against the cabin walls. The creek froze at its edges. Elias worked on the cradle every night by the orange light of the wood stove, his father's hand plane whispering across cherry wood that was older than he was, June curled on a rag rug at his feet, the wind moaning in the stovepipe like a voice trying to remember a song. In mid-December, a young forest ranger named Hannah Pace came down off the ridge following his thread of smoke, expecting poachers, finding instead a 72-year-old man splitting firewood with an axe older than she was and an old blind hound watching from the porch. She was 26. She had lost her own father to cancer 2 years before. Something about the careful way Elias poured her a tin cup of coffee on that first visit made her sit down on his porch step and not get up for almost an hour. She came back 10 days later with flour and apples and matches. She did not call them gifts. She said she had extras. Elias understood what she was doing because he had done the same thing for widows in Pilot Hollow his whole adult life. He let her do it. Some kindness you take because refusing it would hurt the person giving it more than it would hurt you to accept. Then came the last week of January, and the ice storm came with it. It hit in the dark. Elias woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of trees cracking in the woods like rifle shots, huge white oaks snapping under the weight of inch-thick ice, and the stovepipe choked on creosote and the cabin filled with black smoke before he could get the damper open, and a spark kicked up onto a dry rafter and the roof almost went. He fought the fire with handfuls of snow from the porch and a wet wool blanket, his palms burning, his lungs screaming, June barking in terror behind him. He got the flames out. He sat on the plank floor coughing blood-flecked spit into his sleeve and shaking all over. And then, just before dawn, June limped out the door for water. and he heard her yelping from the creek. He ran. His bad hip gave out twice in the snow, and he got back up twice. He crashed through the laurel and saw her, the old blind girl, broken through thin ice in the shallows, pinned against a fallen log, the current dragging her under. Elias Hollis, 72 years old. I waded into water cold enough to stop a younger man's heart. He got his arms under her trembling body, and he lifted her, and he carried her back to the cabin with his legs going numb and his teeth chattering so hard he bit his own tongue bloody. That night, wrapped in his only dry blanket in front of a stove he had almost killed them both trying to save, holding the shivering dog against his chest, Elias Hollis opened his mouth and finally, after 40 years of silence, he shouted at his dead wife. "Why did you leave me?" He roared into the cabin rafters, his voice breaking apart in the smoky air. "Why did you leave me, Corinne? Why did you take her with you? Why did you leave me 40 years of 2 coffee cups and 1 window and nobody to talk to in the morning? I was a good man. I tried to be a good man. I kept my promises. I kept them all." He was sobbing now, the kind of sobbing that comes up from a place 40 years deep. "I am so tired, honey. I am so tired of carrying you like a stone. I don't want to carry you like a stone anymore. I want to carry you like a song. Do you hear me? I want to carry you like a song." And June, wet and half dead, dragged herself across his lap and licked the salt off his wrecked old hands, and something inside Elias Hollis that had been locked since February 1985 fell open, and he wept until he had nothing left. And then he slept. In the morning, the ice was melting off the trees. The sun was out. He could hear a single chickadee calling somewhere in the laurel. June was alive. He was alive. And the cherrywood cradle on the workbench, 3/4 finished, was waiting for him. And if your heart is feeling something right now, please, before I tell you what happens next, do one small thing for me. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell, because stories like this one, stories about the quiet, unseen courage of ordinary people, only reach the world when good people like you help them travel. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. Now let me tell you how Elias Hollis came home. He finished the cradle in early April, on a morning when the sap was running in the old sugar maples his grandfather had tapped 100 years ago, and the cabin smelled of maple steam and beeswax and cherry oil and coffee. He sanded the cradle by hand until the wood was smooth as skin. He rubbed it with walnut oil the way his father had taught him when he was 8 years old. And on the underside of the headboard, and in a place no one would ever see, he carved 4 words and 3 names with the tip of his pocket knife, finished by loving hands: Corinne, Wren, Elias. Then he carried the cradle out of the cabin into the April sun, his hip aching, his eyes wet, June padding slowly at his heels, and he set it under the white oak at the edge of the clearing where the first light of every morning touched the ground. He stood back. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. He said, "Well, Corinne, here we are." And a cardinal, one bright, impossible red cardinal, flew down out of the bare branches and landed on the rail of the cradle. It stayed there for the length of one slow breath. Then it was gone. Elias did not move. He did not try to decide what it meant. He only knew that somewhere 40 years away, on a February night in an ice storm, that a woman had whispered his name before she closed her eyes, and he had been trying to hear her ever since. And this morning, under this oak, beside this cradle, for one single heartbeat, he finally had. 3 days later, Hannah Pace came up the path with a folder in her hand and a look on her face he had never seen before. She had been curious about the cabin. On her own time, she had gone to the county courthouse in Pilot Hollow and pulled the old deed records all the way back to 1911. "Elias," she said gently, sitting down on the porch step beside him, "this land was deeded to your grandfather Josiah Hollis in 1911. When he died in 1968, it passed to your father. When your father died in 1986, it passed to you. Elias, This cabin and the 5 acres it sits on have been legally yours for 40 years. It's in a folder somewhere. You just never knew. Elias Hollis sat very still on the porch of his own cabin on his own land and looked out at the cradle under the white oak. He remembered the folder. He remembered the week it arrived from the lawyer in 1986, 1 year after Corinne died, when he was a ghost walking around inside his own body, and he had filed that folder unread in the bottom drawer of his workshop desk and never opened it again. The land had been his the entire time. Every day of those 40 years of grief, there had been a place in the woods with his name on it, waiting. The developer in Pilot Hollow had taken the house on Dogwood Lane, but the house on Dogwood Lane had never been the thing he was supposed to end up in. This cabin, this clearing, this oak, this cradle, and this was where his grandfather had started something in 1952 and left it for him to finish. This was where Corinne had been steering him, in her quiet way, for 40 years of mornings at a windowsill. He lowered his face into his hands and his shoulders shook, and Hannah Pace, 26 years old and already an orphan, put her young hand on his old shoulder and did not say a word. 1 year later, almost to the day he walked out of Pilot Hollow with a canvas duffel and nowhere to go, Elias Hollis stood on his porch at sunrise with a cup of coffee in his hand. Just 1 cup now. He drank it slow. Behind him, June, slower, grayer, still here, thumped her tail on the plank floor. In front of him, across a clearing full of morning light, stood the cradle under the white oak, and beside the cradle, and a small stone he had carved himself in the summer, with 2 names on it: Corinne, Wren, loved, never lost. He had brought them home the only way he could. He visited the stone every morning. He poured a splash of his coffee into the grass beside it. He told them about the weather. He told them about June's bad leg. He told them about the young ranger who came by on Sundays now and sometimes stayed for supper. He told them he loved them. He told them he was not carrying them like a stone anymore. He was carrying them like a song. The developer in Georgia never knew a cabin existed. The house on Dogwood Lane became a vacation rental for strangers. But deep in the Blue Ridge, at the end of a creek called Sawyer's Fork, an old luthier with careful hands finished what his grandfather had started 70 years before. And an old blind hound slept by the stove, and a cardinal came back to the white oak every April, and a 73-year-old man who had lost everything the world said mattered finally learned that home is not a house. Home is the place your love is buried and your hands are kneaded and your name is remembered by the wood. And so, before you go, let me ask you something, and I want you to really sit with it for a moment. If the world took everything from you tomorrow, your house, your people, every plan you ever made, and left you with only a duffel bag and a broken heart and one long road into the unknown, do you believe, somewhere deep down, that love has already gone ahead of you and built a place where you can be found? Tell me in the comments. Tell me about the person you are still carrying. Tell me if you are carrying them like a stone, or if you have learned, like Elias, to finally carry them like a song. I will read every single one. Hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and I will see you in the next story. A warm embrace to every one of you. Good night.